Hello, my name is David Mullowney. I teach ASL at the Rhode Island School for the Deaf. My presentation today is about deaf culture and community and who we are, and we want to expose you and give you some better understanding about who we are. And we've been here on Earth a long time, but you perhaps have never met a deaf person before. And so I want to share my experience with you so that you will be more comfortable in approaching deaf people, understanding their culture and their background. Our game plan for this video and our travel through this discussion will be that we will open with a discussion of what is deaf culture. What is the difference between the terms deaf, hard of hearing, and deaf blind? They are not all the same. We will discuss the differences. Our preferred accommodations during our visit or appointment, what we would prefer. Also, I'm going to share my experiences with the healthcare system, growing up, and the experiences my friends have shared with me. And the deaf community is so small that we share our stories and experiences and frustrations and struggles. And sometimes when our friends share with us, we attempt to provide them feedback to help them improve their future meetings and appointments. Also, I'm going to talk about some do's and don'ts and give you some advice. And it's going to be great. So let's get started. Deaf culture is very collective. In hearing, the hearing world is so huge that you do not need to come together and collaborate. You have plenty of hearing friends. Probably living here in Rhode Island, you might not have hearing friends in Connecticut or New York. Maybe you don't know those people because you have such a bond here. But deaf people tend to have friends and relatives in all different cities, states, and countries. We share the same experiences, going to the same kind of deaf schools and deaf clubs. In our lives and our frustrations, we share that common understanding. Deaf people love to get together and communicate and share about their lives, share our knowledge, our ideas, our experiences, and the stories that fill our lives. Most, I'm not saying all, but most deaf people use American Sign Language, ASL. ASL itself is a visual language that includes body language, facial expression, use of hand signs. It is not just merely a signing process. If a hearing person is angry, there's more emphasis in your voice and you get mad, you can hear it in your tone. With deaf people, you will notice that there's more facial expression, their body language changes. So ASL includes all of that in its language. We have traditions, family stories passed down over generations of the deaf school and its traditions, a deaf club. And what I mean by that is that deaf people would either rent or own a building where many people would come together for bingo night or deaf events, hosting holiday parties, different reasons, possibly fundraising activities. They would all come together in one center and sign. And that would be the only communication. And so deaf clubs have started to decline because of technology, but that's a whole different issue. We have deaf family, generational stories. I know some people who are 6th, 7th, and even 8th generation deaf. We have deaf literature, we have ASL stories. It's really, really fascinating. Deaf also have artists, some really wonderful artists, painters, using hand shapes, deaf experiences, our frustrations, and demonstrating those through art, and being able to show to the world that this is the deaf experience. We also tend to use pointing. You'll say, look over there, that person in the red shirt, and then comment. In deaf culture, it's okay to point. It's okay to touch. If you are looking away from me and I want your attention, I will come up and tap you on the shoulder. Hearing person might stand behind and call the person's name, but in deaf culture, it's much more acceptable to tap people on the shoulder and get their attention. Lightly, of course, you don't want to do it too hard, but that will be discussed later in the presentation. Deaf culture also is that deaf people tend to go on and on. Deaf people won't say goodbye one time. They'll probably say it 10 times before they actually leave, because they're trying to get to that point. But deaf people tend to just go on and on. And again, as I said, getting attention, you can wave, you can stomp your feet on a floor, you can hit a table to cause a vibration, flashing the lights works as well. There's a lot of different ways that we get people's attention. Very different from where a hearing person would just call out a name and get someone to turn. We have different options for that. It really depends on the situation, how the people are seated, whether they're looking toward each other or not. Also, you can show emotion. When you're driving, you see how my lips here are calm, so I'm just kind of driving through town. But if I change my face to this, then perhaps it looks as if I'm more stressed. I don't know where I'm going. That facial expression is included right there, instead of just saying, I was driving and I got lost and I was really stressed out. I can just show you with the sign for driving and my facial expression and my body language how I am driving. Or perhaps I'm driving a long drive. It changes my facial expression, and you can show all that in one place. We also have deaf artists. The picture on the screen there is Nancy Rourke. She's a famous deaf artist drawing deaf culture. We have so many deaf artists, and it's wonderful to support their business, purchasing their art. It's nice to be able to collaborate and cherish and support their art. And you perhaps know that artist because they have some relation to your family or your friends. Some people wonder, what's up with deaf people? Like, really, there is no difference from hearing to deaf. In hearing world, you have public schools, private schools, charter schools, all of those things. We have those. We have the deaf school right here, Rhode Island School for the Deaf. It is a public school under the state. We have K through 12 for deaf and hard of hearing and deafblind students all coming to the school. There are deaf programs, meaning in a public school, they could have a deaf program or they could have a mainstream program. There's a lot of different options. In Washington, D.C., here in the United States, there's Gallaudet University. It is the only deaf university in the world that is run by deaf. The president, the provost, the administration, frontline people, teachers, and staff, they either are deaf or they know sign language. And so it is completely accessible at Gallaudet. It is just so easy to be understood. You can grow and succeed because access is at the key. Hearing people get access from exposure to sound. They hear what's going on. It's free. They're able to listen. But for us, you need to be able to have someone who signs. And so at Gallaudet, that was a really wonderfully rich language experience. RIT and NTID, RIT is a hearing college in New York, and they have an AAS degree program at NTID. And they have plenty of interpreters and accommodations, and they understand deaf students. There is CSUN, similar program. There's also in California. There's also Southwest College for the Deaf, which will be doing welding and car repair, more vocational hands and visual type jobs. That's going to be happening. And we also have Mazzeria now. It is a deaf-owned pizzeria in Washington, D.C. It's very close to Gallaudet University. It's run by deaf people. And if you go in there, you will be faced with a deaf person. And if you don't know how to communicate, you're going to have to write back and forth or gesture. And if you know how to sign, of course, that works too. It's similar to if a hearing person, went into any restaurant or store, and what we as deaf people know what to expect. We tend to get bad experiences. We tend to have to write back and forth. But it's wonderful that the Mazzeria now has deaf staff so that we can just sign. And now hearing people understand the struggle that we face when we go into hearing restaurants. There is the crazy. There's By Mara, which is clothes with lots of I love you hands on them, baby clothes, adult clothes, keychains, stickers with the I love you hand on it. They're great. That's deaf run. There's 58 Creative, which is on Instagram. So popular. They make calendars and card games and really anything that can involve ASL. The numbers are hand shapes, 1, 2, 3. It's not regularly just printed numbers of the Roman numbers. So you have hearing universities, hearing colleges, all those things. We have those same things. People just don't know about it, but we have all of these things as well. So now that we are equal, we have the same things. There's really no difference. The only difference is how we communicate and that we can't hear or how we hear. Everything else is exactly the same. Now, what is the difference between deaf, hard of hearing, and deaf blind? The medical linguistic perspective, deaf means profoundly deaf, means you cannot hear anything. Perhaps you could hear a really bad accident or feel the vibration of a plane above, but it would have to be really loud. You can't hear anything quiet. Hard of hearing means that you can hear to mild to moderately. Hard of hearing people sometimes can hear well, sometimes they can't. They just need you to boost up the volume. It really varies. There is no one label for hard of hearing. Some people speak very well. Some people do not speak that are hard of hearing, but they can hear better. So it's really not standard. Similar with deaf. Some people who are deaf use ASL very fluently, others do not. It varies greatly. And if you met a deaf patient and assumed they were all the same, you would be wrong. It's really based on their life experience, their family, their growing up, their educational background. There's so many layers that impact their cognitive ability and their communication. So it really has a lot more to do with than just being a deaf person or a hard of hearing person. Deaf blind is also very diverse. Sometimes people can see straight ahead of them, but there is no peripheral vision until you get right in front of their eyes and then they can see you. Some people have floaters or black spots, but most deaf blind use protactile ASL. It would be sign, and then the deaf blind person would put their hand on top of my hand and understand what I was signing to them. And so we would communicate in that way. And perhaps you've seen some people who do that. It's much more based on touch. There's also now one where you use touching of the back. And so it's based on so many things, hearing level, all of those things. How you identify us, some is deaf, some is hard of hearing. It is the right of that person to make the decision of how they identify themselves. Some of my friends speak and hear very well, but they still prefer to be called deaf, and I respect that, even though they can speak and hear. But the medical perspective and the cultural perspective of hard of hearing are very different. So that's what those three words mean. And deafblind just has that added visual impairment instead of the first two, which are just related to auditory. And so it's about what you're comfortable calling yourself. So what should you call us? Deaf, hard of hearing, deafblind. But it's really about us identifying ourselves. It would be best if you asked the person, how do you identify, and let them know, let them let you know, and then you can make note of that. That person will have more trust, seeing that you're investing time in the appointment and remembering how they prefer to be referred to, you know, instead of, oh, I can't remember, what is it you call yourself? So we've had a lot of problems in the past, and we haven't trusted others in the healthcare. So just those three things are what we would like to be identified as. And the second column, please don't call us deaf mute, hearing impaired. That's an old term that shouldn't be used. It's offensive. And deaf and dumb. People who are deaf. Those are old terms from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And we're now in 2021, and sometimes still people use those words, but please do not. And look at the bottom here. It says, ask the person what they want to be called, deaf or hard of hearing or deaf blind. Ask them, they will tell you, and you can make note of it to call them that going forward. So that's, you know, what you should do is ask what they prefer to be called. Our preferred accommodation for appointments. We may request an ASL interpreter. Some would ask for an ASL interpreter plus a CDI, which means that you are providing 2 interpreters for 1 appointment, but I will explain that more in the next slide, what exactly an ASL interpreter does differently than a CDI, and why you could not just use an ASL interpreter without the CDI. Captioning, text, being able to read what is spoken, VRI, video relay interpreting, which is remote interpreting. It looks like an iPad that is on a metal kind of cart, and it's rolled around and connected. The interpreter is not live. They are not in person in the office. They are remote somewhere else in the country or the world. Interpreting, and they listen to what the doctor or other people in the room have to say. My experience with VRI is that it's not that great. It's a great, like sometimes the connection is fine and the Wi-Fi is smooth, but myself, I feel very disconnected. My wife last year had ultrasound appointments, and they would always give me VRI because there was a limitation due to COVID of how many people could be in the room. So they would bring in the VRI cart, and the doctor and my wife would be talking, and I couldn't look at them. I would have to look at the VRI tablet. And as they continued to talk, they would stop and look at me, and then I would realize I'd wait for the interpreter to catch up. It would take 5 or 10 seconds, and then I could answer to the interpreter. I couldn't answer to my wife and the doctor, and in the group where everyone was speaking, I felt very disconnected because I had to answer to the interpreter on the screen and then wait for them to voice that back to my wife's doctor. So it was very disconnected. You know, it's great. Some deaf people really love VRI. Some people have different experiences. I wasn't very comfortable with it. Clear masks are something new because of COVID. Deaf people do prefer a clear mask so that they can see your entire face. It would be nice if your office had a few. You don't have to have a huge stock, but just a few clear masks ready in case a patient comes in who's deaf or hard of hearing. So that's important because you never know. It's nice to have everything ready, and they're right there. Instead of thinking, oh, I should have, you can have it right there. And with these things, effective communication can happen. You want to make sure you don't have old, weak equipment. You want to make sure that everything works and that the deaf person will have a satisfactory experience at their appointment. So these are some things that we want provided as accommodations. This will cover most things in general. Okay, now I said that I would explain the difference between an ASL interpreter and an ASL interpreter means that is a hearing person who has learned ASL as their L2 or second language. They are not yet 100% competent in ASL. They may be a good interpreter, but there may be situations where a CDI can help. As an ASL interpreter, a hearing person, they are really strong in their L1, spoken English or spoken Spanish. They really know and are able to communicate in L1. But it takes years and years to learn a new language. You could be 20 years as an interpreter and still not be 100% perfect. Hearing interpreters who are learning their L2 take years of struggle to improve it. Perhaps an interpreter learns sign language at age 20 or 25, and then they become an interpreter at age 35. So their experience of using the language is only limited to 10 years. It's not as if they were born deaf and used the language all the time. A CDI, their language, their L1 is ASL. And a deaf patient, if their language is ASL, they can be more fluent with body language, the level of ASL. You can use more classifiers, more facial expression, and make it much more clear. The CDI is also skilled in matching the language skills of the patient, reading the patient and understanding if they are understanding the information or if they need to clarify again. So CDIs are born deaf. They're deaf 24/7 from the time they wake up until the time they go to sleep. They don't have an option of talking for a week or two and then going back to signing. They know and understand the culture and the language, and there is an understanding between them. However, the problem is you can't just get a CDI to come, because how will they communicate with the doctor? So obviously you have to have two interpreters. You need an ASL interpreter for information between the CDI and the doctor and the patient. And then you need the CDI for the patient to give more clarification and more understanding. That is the difference. CDIs have been very hot recently, especially recently during press conferences. You'll see a governor on the screen, and then the person standing next to them signing is usually a deaf person, a CDI, and the deaf people in the audience can completely understand what is being presented. Their language matches the audience. And so you can make sure that it is clearly understood. Having a CDI there matches all of the audience and allows everyone to understand. They understand the entire range. And so CDIs are definitely worth it, and they can impact a patient's experience with a provider where they feel as if they really understand and feel supportive and feel supported by the doctor's office with both an ASL and a CDI interpreter. It's a great investment in the preferred accommodations of a deaf person. Not all deaf people prefer a CDI. Some people just need an ASL interpreter, but it varies. So that's the explanation of the difference. Our experience with healthcare. Most deaf people do not trust the healthcare system. There have been numerous communication failures, not providing what we need, and things that happen to a friend of a friend of a friend. We hear those stories. Maybe a person had cancer and they didn't know it. and there was an ASL interpreter who wasn't certified. That's another important issue, making sure that you have a certified ASL interpreter. The interpreter in that situation was not certified. And the doctor said, I have some sad news, you have cancer. And the interpreter didn't want to tell the person. I'm not sure what was said, but the patient was like, oh, okay, and went on with their life, but they felt worse and worse and worse. And so they called and got an appointment with a different interpreter who was certified. And they asked the doctor, why am I sick? And the doctor said, I told you you had cancer, but they had never understood because the interpreter wasn't certified. And so that made the deaf person very resistant to the healthcare system. And so it's important that the person be certified and professional and know what they're doing, so there are no misunderstandings. There is so much miscommunication and misinformation. If there's something on the news in English or an article, a lot of deaf people don't understand it and they get frustrated and they just disconnect. During COVID, with the interpreter next to the governor, people understood more about what was going on because we were provided access. So we felt more connected and trusted and listened to what the governor was saying about healthcare. Access is so important. And if there is no access, deaf people will just not pay attention. So deaf people truly appreciate a really symbiotic relationship. There's been a lack of relationship with providers because communication has never been clear. So my suggestion is, when you ask them, how are you doing? The same as you do with your hearing patients, doctors like, hey, how's your day? What's happening on the news? Things like that. That happens. But sometimes with a deaf patient, they just skip directly to what's the problem? Let's go on, get on with it. And so there's no real connection with the doctor. And so we will try to find another doctor who will connect more with us and establish a relationship of trust. Lastly, frustration. We're just exhausted by needing to educate others about our needs. We say we need an interpreter. Well, what do you need an interpreter for? How do we get an interpreter? Well, you need to contact the Rhode Island Commission. I have to give them the phone number. You give them the form. We have to do all of that work. And they call and they still don't get an interpreter. So they want to reschedule, but it's not my fault. How many times did they call the commission? Once, twice? Oh, really? Or did they call them several times to find out what was going on? It's tiring to educate people about getting an interpreter. I could just say, forget it. I don't want to go to the doctor. I don't want to go to the dentist, just because of all that frustration. So I also suggest do not use a family member as an interpreter. If you have a patient who has a daughter or a son or anyone who comes with them who's hearing and you think, oh, I'll save money, do you mind interpreting for me? That person might not feel comfortable. You need to respect that. So these are 3 experiences I wanted to give you about our work with the healthcare industry. Here are some do's. Things like refer to us as deaf or hard of hearing, based on what we've told you our identification is. Please use that, what we've told you. You can wave. If I'm looking away, a wave's not really gonna work because I'm behind you. If you call my name, I'm not gonna hear you. But if you walk up and tap me, or if I'm on my phone, wave in front of me, that works. Sometimes you can use the light, but that's more for like a whole room of people that you're trying to get the attention of, not just one person, because you want everyone will look if you flash the lights. In a doctor's office, you should come up and tap or wave. Should always face the deaf. Don't look away and talk to the nurse or talk to someone else, because the deaf person will not understand what you're saying. Don't worry about the interpreter. The interpreter will ask you if they need a clarification or if there's a problem with where everyone is standing. And the deaf patient might ask you to move so they can see the interpreter clearly. Also, make eye contact. Don't be looking around while you're talking. Make sure to continue to have eye contact with the deaf person and invest in that relationship. ASL uses facial expression and eye contact for communication. Use natural gestures. Ask them how they're sleeping. If there's no interpreter there, sometimes that can be confusing about who's talking if you're gesturing. But if the interpreter hasn't arrived yet, you can use a little bit of gesturing. You can say hello, natural gestures that you could use in conversation. If you're going to have a conversation, make sure the deaf person knows the topic of the conversation that you are going to discuss. Tell them first where you're going so that they don't have to file through all that information. Give them the topic first and then dive deep. Also, make sure to check in and see if the deaf person understands you. Ask if they have any questions, if they need any clarity. They may just feel overwhelmed, and in the car, they'll remember all these questions. Make sure that you pause and ask them if they have any questions, because deaf patients will tend to ask a question. If they're quiet, you might feel that you should check in with them and make sure that they really understood everything and clarify if necessary. Also, be open to people with different communication methods. Please respect what everyone chooses. If you're going to change topics, make sure that you have gone through 100% of that topic and then move on to another topic. Keep things separate rather than overlapping them and making it confusing. Do not start speaking if a deaf person is not looking at you. Get them to look at you and then proceed to the conversation. It's really important that you're face-to-face making eye contact. Just talk at an appropriate pace, not too fast, not too slow. Don't really try to extend your mouth to make the sound. Ask the person if they can read lips. Most deaf people do not like to read lips. You can only get about 25 to 30% from the lips. So you might catch a word, but then the next word you miss, and you catch the third word. You might have had 3 or 4 words between the 2 words you understood, and then you have to work on how to connect them. And so that's a lot of struggle and a lot of work, and you're still talking. So it's definitely overwhelming. Don't ask us to read lips, much better to write back and forth, because it's frozen in time and we can actually read the word rather than trying to understand it on your lips. Do not stand with a window or a bright light behind you. It can be very distracting when the sun is in the eyes of the deaf person. And as I said before, don't switch topics without warning. Don't start talking about cancer and then switch to talking about medication or treatment. Make sure you're talking about cancer. You have cancer, let's understand everything about it, the stage, all of those things, be set with that, and then say, okay, now we're going to move on and talk about treatment and what that will look like. Keep things separated rather than letting things run into each other. So now my advice. Don't make any assumptions. Assumptions based on prior experience with other deaf patients. When a new patient comes in and assuming they're the same, they are very different. Their accommodations, their styles, their preferences, may be very different. One person likes VRI, one person wants a CDI. Don't assume that everyone is the same. It's a new person, they're deaf, and don't assume. And if you're not sure, ask them. Say, I'm not really sure. What's your advice? Could you help us out? And they would be happy to explain. Some people don't want to explain. They're going to say, no, you figured out yourself, but that's okay. Then you should do that work. But if you don't know, ask. With hearing patients, you tend to build relationships and bonds, and they come back and back for more appointments. But sometimes deaf people, the experience isn't good, and there's no relationship built. Doctors just drop all that and focus on the issue or the medical part of the appointment. Let's get through this, rather than having an introductory conversation, much that they would with a hearing person. So have them come in, build a bond, take the time and relax. And if you're not sure about something, just ask us or Google. I'm sure you can find information about deaf businesses and deaf people. And sometimes hearing people take over deaf news and things like that. YouTube. I teach ASL in the deaf school and at CCRI. And I meet so many students who said, oh, I saw this thing on YouTube. It was so cool. It's so many mistakes. If it's a hearing person teaching you ASL, it's not what you should do. They are taking over our language and taking a profit off of it. And so look for deaf resources, deaf people, deaf businesses, people who use ASL as their L1, rather than watching things that are made by hearing people. Do your homework, make sure it's deaf-based. That's my advice. If you don't know, ask. Be open. Not all deaf people are the same. Thank you. And I hope you understand better. And if you happen to have a deaf patient, you will know what to do. Thank you for watching my presentation. Have a good day.